My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. This week, novelist Joshua Henkin, author of Swimming Across the Hudson and, most recently, Matrimony.
I'm always telling my students, and I tell myself this too, that it's far better to go over the top because you can always cut back. You want to risk sentimentality in order to have sentiment. You don't want sentimentality. You don't want your story or your novel to be cheesy. But you also don't want the other problem, which is that the story has no heart. And so I think one of the reasons that my students avoid story is they are trying to avoid what they perceive to be cheesiness. But what I encourage them to do is to be cheesy, because you can always revise. I mean, this is why I spent 10 years and 3,000 pages, 10 years working on the book and erasing 3,000 pages, that I'm a control freak, and that I think that, you can always cut back. So for all those reasons, I think, both psychological and narrative, those are the kinds of reasons that my students avoid story. But I think story is very important.
Every single interview from the Marketplace of Ideas is available on our online archive. Visit us at www.colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace. You can download each show, or you can stream any of them in your browser. Join the International Marketplace of Ideas listening community by adding yourself to our Frapper listener map. The link is right on our front page, colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace. My guest is novelist Joshua Henkin, author of Swimming Across the Hudson and now the 10 years in the making Matrimony. He teaches writing at Sarah Lawrence College and Brooklyn College. Josh, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here.
When I was preparing for the interview and when I was reading the book itself, Matrimony, I was trying to judge, I was debating with myself whether or not to approach it as being about one of your main characters, Julian Wainwright, or about his marriage, but we'll get into that conflict later. I want to keep it simple to start off. Who is Julian Wainwright?
Yeah, Julian Wainwright is a very wealthy kid from the Upper East Side of Manhattan. He's the son of an investment banker who graduated from Yale, and Julian wants to be a novelist, and all his life he's been trying to get out from under his parents' influence, and so he goes off to college in Western Massachusetts to study creative writing, and there he meets Mia Mendelsohn, whom he ends up marrying, and that's sort of the trajectory the book goes on.
And who is Mia?
Mia's a very different character from Julian. She's Jewish from Montreal. Julian's a WASP. Her father's an academic. And she also, in her own way, has come to Graymont College to get out. And they meet in the college laundry room freshman year and fall in love. And not ruining too much, because it happens fairly early in the book, when I say that Mia's mother gets very sick senior year, and this prompts Julian and Mia to get married much earlier than they otherwise would have, and the book goes in a direction that no one could have anticipated.
One of the themes in the book that I've found is crisis as a motivator of action. Would that be too far from base to say that?
No, I think that's true. I mean, I mentioned Mia's mother's sickness prompting Julian and Mia to get married much earlier than they otherwise would have. There are other crises that take place in the book that send the characters in directions they hadn't anticipated. The book takes place over the course of 20 years, and it takes place in New York and then in a series of college towns, the fictional Northington, which is based on Northampton, in Ann Arbor, and Iowa City, and Berkeley. And I think when you have a novel that takes place over 20 years, I mean, almost in any person's life, when 20 years pass, there are various tragedies that take place, and they cause people to do things that they wouldn't have otherwise done. So I certainly think that key moments of crisis prompt the characters to do things that are new to them.
Now, in other writing about Matrimony and in some guest blogging you've done, some interviews, you've mentioned that the first image you had in your mind, the seed out of which Matrimony grew, was the image of a couple at a college reunion, and now you have this novel with a very large, for its type, a time scale. Was it originally, did you get to that point where you were saying this has got to span this length of time, or did that just end up happening?
Well, I mean, some combination. I think mostly it just ended up happening, and then, as you said, the book took 10 years, and I threw out more than 3,000 pages. So I think any writer, things happen, and then you make mistakes, and you start over again. But I believe pretty firmly that a fiction writer shouldn't plan out too much. I think if you plan out too much, you inject your characters in a preordained plot, and you get what a friend of mine called Lipton cup of story. And for me, fiction is really very fundamentally about character. You know, when I read a book, what I want at the end of the book is I don't have to necessarily like the characters, but I want to feel at the end of the book that I know the characters as well as, or sometimes even better than, the people in my own life. And if a novel does that to me as a reader, then I think it's done well by me. And so as a writer, that's what I want to do as well, to make sure that, you know, the reader feels like he or she really knows these characters. And for me, the way to do that is not to plan out too much in advance, to allow the characters room to breathe. So what I try to do in general is to start out with a situation where something can happen, where there can be some kind of conflict. And I think that's why I thought of the college reunion, is that reunions are occasions when people who knew each other long ago come back into contact, and there can be conflict as a result. But pretty quickly, I realized that the reunion was really at the end of the book, and that there is a reunion in the novel, but it takes place probably around page 270, and it lasts for all of 6 or 7 pages. So I realized pretty early on that the book was covering a long period of time, and that it starts when Julian and Mia are 17, 18, and goes until they're almost 40. So the book is really, in some deep way, about a generation. And if I can go off on that a little bit, I mean, even though the book is in part about a marriage, it's actually about several marriages. And the book is also very fundamentally about class. I mean, Julian is a rich kid from New York City, and he meets his best friend Carter, who is a poor kid from California. And the book is about how rich people who don't want to be rich and poor people who don't want to be poor. But I think also more metaphorically, the book is what it's like to be in your 20s, 30s, in some cases early 40s, where you're waiting for your life to begin. And at some point you realize that your life has already begun, and that life is what happens when you're not paying attention. And I think this may be particularly true in college towns, where there's a kind of sense of arrested development, where you think, there are a new bunch of students every year, and you're constantly renewing yourself, and then at some point you realize you're getting older. But I think it's true in general, maybe of my generation. I'm now in my early 40s, and I think a lot of us felt that at some point we'd be adults, and suddenly we realized that adulthood kind of sideswipes us, and we've made decisions when we're young that have consequences that we didn't really anticipate. And so in that sense, the book is about my generation.
And you've touched on a lot of things that I was going to bring up there with that answer. Number one being the lack of a watershed moment, a Rubicon you cross into adulthood. I'm guessing that is what you yourself found. One day you looked back and you said, hey, I'm a grown-up. When was that?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. I think part of what happened is that I, too, even though Julian is quite different from me in certain ways, like Julian, I lived in a lot of college towns. And so I lived in Ann Arbor, where he and Mia live, for some time. And at some point I realized I was 30, and everyone else in Ann Arbor was either 19 or 50. And I was trying to figure out, where I fit in. But I also think, when I started the book, I was single and living in Ann Arbor. And when I finished the book, I was married and had 2 kids and was living in Brooklyn. So I went through a lot of changes myself. And I think, when you're a kid, you think that when you become an adult and when you do certain adulthood things, like get married, have children, buy a house, have a job, that you have your life together. And I know when I was a kid and I saw my friends' parents, they all seemed so adult. And then you start to see your friends and yourself doing some of those same things, and you realize you don't feel quite as adult as you thought adults did, and that makes you sort of rethink the equation. I remember years ago I read an essay in The Nation, I think it was, by Calvin Trillin, where he said that he turned 40 and realized that all the people he went to college with were ruling the world. And it made him very fearful. And I kind of feel the same way, that, some of the kids I went to college with are doing some pretty important things, and that's pretty frightening to me, knowing what they were like in college.
Looking back and seeing their, not troubled youth, but it might have been less responsible in previous
Certainly.
decades.
I'm not totally sure they're more responsible now. They're just more powerful.
I see. That is slightly scary. You mentioned college towns and that phenomenon where you find everybody staying the same age, but you're growing older, and how that affects the lack of a moment where you can tell that you've become an adult. Is that unique to the resident of a college town? They especially are hit with that realization that they're an adult without actually realizing it while it happens? Yeah,
I don't think it's unique to college towns, but it may be more salient in college towns. I mean, college towns have a lot of people who sort of hang on, who, start to get their PhD and then go work in bookstores. There are a lot of people who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who feel like they're a lot younger. So I think it's probably particularly true of college towns. And there's something about, those certain signposts that, come each year, homecoming, spring break, finals, etc., that makes you feel like things are constantly repeating themselves and everything is self-renewing. But I certainly think that it's true beyond college towns. And, we know the phenomenon of young people who graduate from college moving back in with their parents. And, my generation has been accused of arrested development. I actually think I think it's more complicated than that. And I think there are wonderful things about college towns, and there are wonderful things about, wanting to hang on to youth. But certainly I think, for Julian and Mia, it's a complicated situation because, Mia's mother gets sick and dies, and then they move to Ann Arbor, and they're forced to be adults in ways that are particularly hard in college towns. I mean, they're 22, 23 years old, and they are sort of culturally, demographically, generationally speaking, not the kinds of people who would get married at 22 or 23. And most of their friends, Mia's studying psychology, she's getting her PhD in psychology. Julian's a writer, and he's working on his novel. Most of their friends, for most of their friends, marriage is the furthest thing from their minds. There's a way in which they've been forced to grow up much sooner than they otherwise would have. Mia's mother has died, and so that's another way that she's forced to become an adult. And so I think it's particularly true in college towns. There's this contrast between, youth and adulthood that may be more stark. But I certainly think it's true outside of college towns as well.
And I wanted to go back, since you mentioned it, the issue of class in Matrimony. Now, when reading it, I didn't think to myself of it as being a class novel. But you mentioned Carter, the third. Well, I guess you could call him either the third point of a triangle early on, or the fourth corner of a square, because he's got his girlfriend Pilar. In any case, he's trying to escape his roots later on in the book, and as is Julian trying to escape his roots with the investment banker father in New York City. And as to an extent, I would say Mia is. I'm not sure how much you would agree that Mia is escaping her roots, but you can comment on that in a little bit when I finish this rambling question. Now, how successful are these characters in escaping their roots, do you think?
I'd say they're partially successful and in other ways not successful, which I think is true of all of us. There's, it's easy to read the book and not notice class, but I think it's, in the same way that it's easy to live in America and not notice class, but I think it's really pervasive both in the book and in America. There's a moment, probably about 100 pages into the book, where Julian and Carter are about to graduate, and Carter wants to know if they're still going to be friends in 10 years, and Julian says he hopes so. And Carter, who's, the working class kid, who's the scholarship student, says he isn't so sure. And then Carter mentions something that his father said, which is that in college is a kind of equalizing force, that you're all taking the same classes and doing the same things, but then you graduate and things sort of shake out in the end. And I really noticed that among my friends at college, that there's a kind of leveling force about being in school together. But then people go their own way. In a lot of ways, they end up becoming a lot like their parents. And I think, who has money and who doesn't, who has certain expectations of them and who doesn't, become really powerful as you go along. And, in certain ways, the characters certainly transcend their past. Julian grows up in a family of Republican investment bankers, and he's certainly not a Republican himself, and he goes on to be a novelist. And Mia charts her own past, too. But I think there are very deep ways in which it's hard to escape your past. And I guess I would give a couple of examples of this. First of all, the very first words of the book are out, out, out. Those are supposedly the first words that Julian ever said when he was 15 months old. And that's his goal, to get out of New York, to set his own path. But by the end of the book, he's back living in New York. And he's bought a big brownstone, really thanks to his parents' largesse. So in very deep ways, he hasn't escaped his own past. And I think, one of the key moments in the book that some people haven't noticed, and, I don't want to ruin too much here other than to say that something happens with Julian's parents, to Julian's parents' marriage late in the book, that makes Julian rethink things with Mia. He and Mia have split up for a time, and then they get back together. And it really comes about because of what happens with Julian's parents. And I think, I'll say it, and hopefully won't ruin too much. But Julian's parents split up when he's older. And this really gets to Julian. He's very surprised by how devastated he is by this, in part because he's not that close to his parents, but also because he's an adult and he figures that he's past his parents. I had a girlfriend in college whose parents split up when she was in college, and she kind of felt that her friends weren't sufficiently sympathetic. That they had the attitude that, if your parents get divorced when you're 8, 9, or 10, that's tough. But once you're an adult, you've moved on. But I think that for these characters, this book illustrates that when you're with your parents, you never really move on. And we all know that experience, for those of us who still have parents who are alive, of going back to our parents' houses, of going back to the homes in which we grew up, and reverting to high school again. So I think in very deep ways, for Julian, when he's with his parents, he's still a kid. And also for Carter. I mean, Carter's a guy who wants nothing more than to become wealthy. He feels always like a scholarship kid on the outsider looking in. And finally, late in the book, he becomes fabulously wealthy thanks to the internet boom. And he finds that despite the fact that he's fabulously wealthy, he still has this chip on his shoulder. There's a way in which there isn't enough money in the world to make him feel good about himself, and there's a way in which he's got to work things out, perhaps therapeutically, and money isn't the answer. So I do think that the book is Freudian, not in an orthodox sense, but in the sense that our childhoods imprint us very strongly, and you can escape some things, but there are other things that are harder to escape.
You've written elsewhere about that boomerang effect where you can't wait to get away from the parents, and then you come back later in life, and are you more involved when you're in your 40s than you ever were?
I think in some ways you are. I mean, I think a lot depends on what you're doing in your life in general, but I would certainly say that's true of me. I mean, my father just turned 90. I'm 43, so he had me pretty late in life, and he's been in remarkable health until the last 2 or 3 years, but now he's in some pretty serious decline. And I think, this is a sign, I think, of becoming middle-aged, that you're taking care of both your children and your parents. And my father is 90. I have a daughter who's 4, another daughter who's 2. And so I think, provided you have a decent relationship with your parents, as I do, I think often your 20s and 30s are a time when you're pretty self-involved and striking out on your own. And then then in some ways you come back. And I know I certainly have come back. And so I do think that, obviously it depends on the particular person, but for a lot of people I know, that sort of precipice of middle age in your early 40s is a time when you sort of come back to your parents in ways that you maybe hadn't done before.
As we've mentioned before, Julian is a writer. He's working on a novel. During the course of the book, he gets a number of short stories published, and in this, you yourself are a writer writing about writing, and that's a subject you've covered in other venues. And what are the pitfalls of writing about a writer?
Well, I think there are potentially many pitfalls. One thing a writer has to remember is that a writer wants to write about material that's close to him or herself in the sense that you want there to be feeling, but you don't want things to be so close that you can't use your imagination. And there's a potential that because you're a writer, you just assume that everyone's interested in what writers do and you don't make it sufficiently imagined. But in some ways, for me, the biggest problem I had in writing about writing was that internal voice warning me not to write about writing. Writers, I teach writing, and we're always telling our students, don't write about writing. It's, self-indulgent and navel-gazing and solipsistic. And I do think it can be. I mean, I've certainly seen among my undergraduates, for instance, a kind of failure of imagination, that they'll be writing a short story that has absolutely nothing to do with writing, and then all of a sudden a character will mention a short story she's written. And that'll be a sign that, the writer just has writing on the brain. But I actually firmly believe that, that writing about writers is as good a thing or as bad a thing to do as writing about engineers or mobsters or secretaries or doctors, and it's all about the execution. And for me, one of the struggles and one of the reasons, there are many reasons that it took me 10 years to write the book, but one of the reasons it took me so long is that I felt like I wasn't taking the bull by the horns, that I was afraid to write about a writer, and so I did it in a way that was coy or cute or evasive. And at some point I realized that Julian is a writer, and this is one thing that's important to him. And if I'm going to take him seriously, and he takes writing seriously, then I have to take writing about writing seriously. And I actually think that it's wrong to think that there's a problem, an inherent problem in writers writing about writers, because writers don't assume that all doctors are alike, that all engineers are alike, that all mobsters are alike, that all technicians are alike, that all And I think that we shouldn't assume that all writers are alike. And it's a mistake to believe that because a writer is writing about a writer, he's really writing about himself. I mean, in very deep ways, even though Julian's a writer and I'm a writer, I'm probably much more similar to Mia. I'm Jewish, she's Jewish. I'm the son of an academic, she's the daughter of an academic. So there are very deep ways that, despite the writing similarities, I'm quite different from Julian. And when I realized at some point that I didn't have to be self-conscious about writing about a writer, that's when the book really, really took off. So in some ways, the biggest pitfall was worrying about the pitfalls.
Early on in the book, when they're at college, Julian and Carter take a writing class under Professor Chesterfield, who has a number of words of wisdom, but one of them would be, now correct me if I'm wrong, if he actually says this, or if I'm just thinking that he did, but write what you don't know about what you know, or write what you know about what you don't know.
Right.
That's one of his, right?
That is one of his.
Okay,
yeah.
Good deal. As far as writing what you don't know about what you know, when writing Julian, you know writing, and what didn't you know?
I know writing, but what I didn't know about Julian was, some of his insecurities are my own insecurities, but he was writing, he started writing much earlier than I did. I started writing after college. He'd been writing his whole life. I think he really threw his eggs into that basket early on, and I don't think I really knew what that experience was like. And then I think culturally, even though, I went to Harvard for college, I certainly knew what it was like to grow up with sort of a lot of privileged, waspy kids. And I certainly grew up with some privilege, but I didn't grow up fabulously wealthy. I'm not fabulously wealthy. So that sort of waspy heritage, the son of the investment banker, was unfamiliar to me. And I think, the idea that Professor Chesterfield articulates of writing what you know about what you don't know, or what you don't know about what you know, it sounds like a bad LSAT problem, is actually something that I tell my students all the time. I think the tension a writer experiences is between knowing too much and knowing too little. And I think my students err to one extreme or the other, particularly my undergraduates, more so than my graduates. They write simply what they know, which is a transcript of Friday Night's Frat Party, or simply what they don't know, which is Martians. And I think the idea behind writing what you know about what you don't know, or what you don't know about what you know, is you want to have the advantages of closeness and the advantages of distance. I think writing what you know about what you don't know would be imagining a situation that's unfamiliar to you and putting yourself in that situation. And writing what you don't know about what you know would be imagining someone else in a situation that is familiar to you. The very first writing workshop I was in as a student, a friend of mine wrote what was a transparently autobiographical story about her breakup with her first boyfriend. But it was actually a better story than that thumbnail sketch sounds. And, we all said what we really liked about the story, and then there was one scene that we all agreed wasn't working. And when it was my friend's turn to talk, she said, well, that scene that you thought wasn't working, well, it actually happened. And, the appropriate response to that is some kind, gentle version of, who cares? I think anyone who's writing fiction believes that what you're doing is you're trying to get a deeper kind of truth through lying. And if you're too close to the actual material, if you're too concerned with fidelity to actual truth, then you may not be able to make the right aesthetic decisions. On the other hand, you don't want to be so far from actual truth. You don't want to be writing about material that has, I think a writer always wants to be at risk, has to be emotionally on the page. And so you want to, in very deep ways, be writing about material that's important to you. Because if the characters aren't important to you, there's no way they'll be important to the reader. So I think what Professor Chesterfield was encouraging Julian, and what I encourage my students and encourage myself, is to try to find that balance between, on the one hand, writing about material that is deeply risky, that is very emotionally fraught, that you care about, that makes you feel conflicted, because that's going to come out in the page in a good way, but not to be writing about material that's so close to you that you tell it because it actually happened. Because the fact that something actually happened doesn't matter in fiction. What matters is to make it work. And so that's the balance that I think Julian was striving for and that I strive for in my own fiction.
Now, we never see Julian's writing in the book. We don't know a whole lot about Julian's writing, in fact, other than that he does it. And was that always, through all of the many revisions of Matrimony, the many drafts, the case?
No, that's a great question. In the early drafts, we actually did see Julian's writing. And part of what was going on was that because I was uncomfortable initially about writing about a writer, I treated the subject matter more ironically, and I made Julian a less good writer than he ended up being, and I sort of had bits of his writing that were in certain ways well written on a sentence level, but in deep ways they didn't have enough substance. And at a certain point in the book, I realized that I wanted Julian to be a better writer than he had first seemed to be, and so I really changed the book entirely in that regard and changed the tone. And I considered putting in actual pieces of Julian's writing, but I decided that I was going to muddy the waters in ways that I didn't want to. And although you don't think you see Julian's writing, I don't think I'm ruining too much at the end of the book to say that if you look carefully at the last page of the book, there's at least a suggestion. It's kind of murky, but there's at least a suggestion that my book is Julian's book. That when the book ends with Julian saying there's nothing more to write because he's waiting to see what will happen next. So indirectly, I think you do end up seeing Julian's writing. You just don't realize it till the end, that the book that I've written is actually the book that Julian has written.
Julian's writing, is that autobiographical then?
Well, at the very, yes and no. At the very end of the book, and and this is where this line that you mentioned before, writing what you know about what you don't know or what you don't know about what you know, comes back again. Because Julian doesn't let Mia read the book. You know, he's been working on this book for 15 years. And it's a combination of his not letting Mia read the book and Mia not wanting to read the book because she's afraid, what if she doesn't like it? I mean, it's a terrible thing, I know, to read something by someone you know and care about and not like the work. It's just totally scary. And so I think Mia mostly doesn't want to deal. But then the book finally does get published, and she reads it. And she says to him, well, you wrote about us, except you made things up. And so I think the answer is that Julian himself is writing what he knows about what he doesn't know or what he doesn't know about what he knows. Namely, he has written about his and Mia's life, but he's made things up. And so in the same way that I am writing material that is close to me but is also on some level fabricated, without getting too meta about it, Julian is doing the same thing. He has written about his marriage, but he's also fabricated material.
And Carter as well has the skill of writing. Certainly he shows promise along with Julian in the beginning of the novel, and that's why they become friends, is the professor singles them both out as being less bad than everyone else in the class. And now, Carter, he's not focused on writing through his life in Matrimony, although he has some success at the end. And then here we have Julian, who is pretty deeply focused. It's always in his mind, his novel. What different writing styles do these two represent? Because they both end up having some success in that craft toward the end.
Right. I mean, I think in certain ways, Carter is probably a more gifted writer than Julian, or certainly a more natural writer, but because he's from this working class background, he says at some point in the book that writing is for rich people and that, poor people can't afford to write. And I think certainly there are plenty of writers who aren't rich, but I do notice this because I do admissions at Sarah Lawrence's MFA program, at Brooklyn College's MFA program, and we see every year how hard it is to attract minority students, because I think often minority students don't have the kind of cushion that some more privileged students have. And so these sort of first-generation minority success stories tend to go to law school, business school, etc. And I think Carter, although he's not a racial minority, he's something of a class minority, I think that's his experience, which is that he needs to go out and make money. But once he does so, I think he realizes that he does really want to write. And he actually achieves success with less effort, or at least takes less time than it takes Julian. And I think, there are different kinds of writers. There are also different kinds of books. I mean, my first novel, Swimming Across the Hudson, took only 3 years. Matrimony took 10 years. I'm working on a new novel now that I hope will take less than 10 years, certainly because it's due at the publisher in a few months, although I'll certainly miss that deadline. But I think each book takes as long as it takes, and there's really no predicting it. So it's hard to know how long a book's going to take. But one of the interesting things about Matrimony is that although it took 10 years to write, and although I threw out more than 3,000 pages, of the actual pages that were in the book, I'd say about 75% got written in the last year. And it's not because I was sitting around eating bonbons, and then all of a sudden I decided to pull a lot of all-nighters. I think the same thing happened with Swimming Across the Hudson on a smaller scale. That the book took 3 years, but probably 75% of it got written in the last few months. And I think what happens with me, at least, is that you make a lot of mistakes and there's a lot of trial and error, and at a certain point you finally figure out the characters, and then it all comes together. And how long it takes until it all comes together differs from book to book. So I wouldn't venture to say that Carter is a quicker writer per se than Julian. It just, things came together with Carter's book more quickly than it did with Julian's book. But if they write another book, it's possible that Julian's next book might take less time. Every book is different, and it's always hard to predict.
Now, when you were throwing out all of these thousands of pages in the last 10 years and doing revision after revision, were these mostly revisions because you didn't know the characters well enough, or were there story issues? You didn't have the story moving forward as you would like, or is one a function of the other? Yeah, I think they're functions of each other. I mean, it's sort of hard to divide the disentangled plot from character, because it's really kind of this tapestry where everything is woven together. I mean, if we think about our own lives, we create our plots, but we're also created by them, and they also do things to us. We make decisions, and those have consequences. But people do things that have impacts on us, and that makes us who we are. So I think it's very hard to say that character exists independent of plot. I certainly felt like I didn't know my characters well enough for a long time. But that's probably what prompted me to make some wrong decisions in terms of narrative. I would say I was making revisions in very deep ways, on the sentence level and on paragraph levels and on scene levels and levels of tone. I mean, of those 3,000 pages, a lot of them are terrible, and some of them are actually okay. And I've had people say to me, "Wow, 3,000 pages, that's 10 novels there. That's a gift that will keep on giving. Will you go back and sort of
try to mine that material for work that will really work in future stories and novels. And I'm really hesitant to do that, even though there are a lot of really probably pretty good pages in that bunch of mess. I worry about sort of trying to build a novel or even build a story around 20 pages that I love. I mean, Annie Dillard has said that you have to kill your babies, and I firmly believe that it's often the material that you love most, that you're working toward, that is really what's infecting the book. And so there's so much bigger vision that went on in the book that even though I think there are things I could go back to and try to save, I really want to put that stuff away and never look at it again, because I'm on to the new book and it's something totally different.
I just wanted to throw a hypothetical out here. Had Julian not been, not forced, but had life not guided him into this early marriage, would he have put his novel together sooner?
So you're asking whether, on some level, the stuff that was going on in his life got in the way of the book?
The marriage specifically.
Yeah. It's so hard to know, because I think when you get married as young as Julian and Mia do, they really form each other. I mean, I certainly think that they loved each other and they continue to love each other, and it doesn't strike me as a mistake, either professionally or personally, that they got married, but if the tragedy hadn't forced them to get married, it's possible that they would have drifted and ended up marrying other people, but it's very hard to know. It's possible that Julian would have finished the book earlier. It's also possible he never would have finished the book. I mean, one thing that happens in the book is, when he and Mia separate for a time, he finds that he's not able to write. And that, there's the myth that, that writers have to be miserable in order to write. But at least in Julian's case, I think he finds that he has to be happy in order to write. So although it sounds crazy to say this because the book took him 15 years, it could be argued that being with Mia made the book get finished earlier than it otherwise would have been possible, that it would have taken him even longer. But, I really don't know. I feel like the two of them getting married when they did, it's just, sends them in a direction that changes them deeply, so that it's hard to know what they would have been like if things had been different. I mean, we all see these moments in our lives where we take one path and we could have taken another, and it's really hard to predict what would have happened if we had taken that other path. And I think that book is very deeply about that, the ways the characters make choices they hadn't anticipated, and then things change from there. That seems to be true of so many people's lives.
Now, to return to the issue that I brought up at the very beginning of the conversation, and forgive the stark phrasing of this question, but is Matrimony about Julian or about the marriage?
I think it's about a lot of things. I mean, if I had to say who the principal characters, I'd probably say Julian, although there have been a lot of reviewers who've, been most struck by Mia. I mean, the Times Book Review, the New York Times Book Review, which gave the book a wonderful review, really focused mostly on Mia, although they focused on Julian too. I actually think it's about Julian and Mia, about their marriage. It's also about, to some extent, about Carter and Pilar's marriage, about Julian's parents' marriage, about Mia's parents' marriage. I do think the book is very deeply about class, even if in subtle ways. So I think any book that covers 20 years is going to have a pretty broad scope. So if I were given the choice between saying the book is about Julian or the book is about Julian and Mia's marriage, I guess I'd go for the broader answer and say it's about Julian and Mia's marriage. But I think I'd make it even broader than that and say it's about marriage and it's about friendship, it's about money. It's about 20 years in the lives of 3 or 4 very fundamental characters.
If you're just tuning in, my guest is novelist Joshua Henkin, author of Swimming Across the Hudson and most recently Matrimony. And with this question, I don't want to force you into sounding self-complimentary or anything, but when I was reading the book, I read it in 2 sittings. I hate to use the phrase couldn't put it down, but I didn't want to put it down. And why is the book such a page-turner now? Because it's about what you would think is a normal sort of situation, but I was pretty gripped by it. And it may be in a technical sense as a writer you can talk about this, because of course you have a lot of experience taking apart, as a writing teacher, pieces of writing. Now, what is keeping the reader so engaged here? Because I certainly was.
Certainly. Well, thank you. It's such a hard question to answer, but other people have asked that, and so I've been forced to think about it a lot. On one hand, even though there's some pretty big events that take place in the book has been described as a relatively quiet book, and that it takes place over 20 years, and there's a lot of big stuff, but there's also a lot of small stuff that we see. And so on one hand, people say it's a quiet book, and on the other hand, people talk about it as a kind of a page-turner. And I think perhaps the reason for that, and maybe this has to do with having thrown out 3,000 pages, because people have asked me, why it took so long. And I always sort of give a glib answer that, a book takes as long as it needs to take. But and that's true, but I've really been forced to think about, why the book took as long as it did. And one of the things I was struggling with was time in a novel. How do you write a novel that takes place over 20 years and avoid making it a kind of boring chronology where you have, and this happened, and this happened, and then that happened. And so I think what I really needed to do was I really needed to sort of think about how I find the moments that are most important. And in this regard, Richard Russo's novel Empire Falls was really helpful in that regard, because he showed me how to use flashback in ways that are really illuminating. And what I needed to do was to sort of find the ways to skip time. And if you're going to write about 20 years, what I sort of did was I jumped around in time. I would start freshman year of college, and then I had senior year of college, and then I skipped 4 or 5 more years. It was like presidential elections. I went in these, in these 4 or 5 year increments. And what I needed to do was find the moments where I could stop and pause, but also fold in flashback. And I know that among my generation, there's sort of a lot of writers who sort of write maximalist, kind of ironic, muscle-flexing prose. And I like a lot of that prose, but that's not how I write. In some ways, I'm more of a traditionalist, and I write, fairly simply and directly. And I think in a lot of ways, it's often harder to be simple and direct than it is to be, less simple and less direct. And I think perhaps the page-turning quality you're referring to has to do with the ways in which, I distill things. I mean, things keep getting shorter. I really wanted to write a book that was 600-700 pages, a big muscular book, but that's not the kind of book that I end up writing. And I think that, starting with over 3,000 pages and ending up with 300 pages means you're really distilling the book to its very essence. There's no excess whatsoever. I don't know how many people have read this book, because it came out a long time ago, but Tobias Wolff has a wonderful novel. It's a wonderful memoir called This Boy's Life, which is actually turned into a movie with Ellen Barkin and Robert De Niro. But that book was in some ways a real model for me, in the sense that I feel like Tobias Wolff's book feels so not written. It feels effortless. And that's really what I'm going for in my own work, is you have to put in years and years of effort to try to make a book feel effortless. And when people say to me that, the book took only a couple of days to read, I think that may be a product of my having to spend so much time cutting out the excess. And I think, there are books that really helped me along the way, that inspired me. I mean, there are various books that I'm trying to think of, Curtis Sittenfeld's novel Prep. I mentioned Richard Russo's Empire Falls, Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections, Ian McEwan's novel Atonement. Those are books that really helped me a lot. And, my book is quite different from those books in a lot of ways. But I think that I write what's known as literary fiction, in the sense that it's really about character. But I'm also a big believer in story, and that you really need to make a reader turn the pages. And so I want the book to be something that people can't put down. And I think that's part of partly why the book took so long, is I really wanted to distill the book into its essence.
And last night, while I was pondering Matrimony in preparation for the interview, kind of recounting the story to myself, and I was getting the image in my mind of the rhythm of the story, the rhythm of the chapters, or the way that they come at you. With every chapter, the reader is placed into the future, as you said, and there's a pretty big leap. And it's kind of like, bam, here you are, here are the facts, you're dropped into it. And then it's the reveal afterward of how it got that way. And it's, bam, then the reveal, and bam, then the reveal. And was that a technique, a storytelling technique that you applied to the book deliberately, or was that just how you found yourself telling the story?
Yeah, it's a great question. Ultimately it was deliberate, although I didn't plan it out in advance. I think the way I write is I don't plan anything out. I do it intuitively. And then I see which of my intuitions are right and which of them are wrong. Often a lot of them are wrong. But once I have that first draft down, then I can sort of think more analytically and try to figure out how to make things work. And so that kind of, bam, dropping your characters down somewhere new, and then you're really dropping the reader down somewhere new at the same time, and then sort of filling the holes in as you go along, ended up being the way that worked best for the book. And, I thought of different ways to do it. You mentioned the jumps in time, and there are also jumps in place. We moved from Northington, which is sort of a college town based loosely on Northampton, Massachusetts, to Ann Arbor, to Berkeley, to Iowa City, back to Ann Arbor, and then back to New York City, which is where Julian grew up. And so there are leaps of time and space. And I think what the writer wants to do is, you want those leaps in time and space because you want to feel like you're taking the reader somewhere new, and the reader doesn't want to feel like he or she is just reading the same stuff over and over again. But you have to make those jumps not so jolting so that the reader is confused. And this is what I always tell my students. Is one of the hardest things for a writer to remember is how much more he or she knows than his or her reader knows. the writer knows everything, and the reader knows nothing until the reader actually starts to read. And so there's that balance between wanting there to be a sense of jolt, a sense of excitement and surprise, but not wanting to confuse the reader. And there's always a tension between, what you tell when and what you tell at the beginning, what you withhold. And then this is a big key to storytelling, is because storytelling is about deferred gratification. If you tell everything at once, there's no reason to want to read on. But if you don't tell enough at the beginning, there's nothing pulling the reader forward. And I think what a writer needs to do is they need to make the reader want to read on without turning it into a cheap kind of hook. I mean, years ago, an undergraduate student of mine wrote a story that started, "I was going to the bank when it happened." And we wait 17 pages to find out what it is. And that feels like a contrivance. It's the writer manipulating the reader into paying attention instead of saying, "Here, reader, pay attention." But the reader is too aware of being hooked. And so I think what a skillful writer needs to do is to hook the reader without seeming like he or she is hooking the reader. And so what I wanted to do was to give these leaps, to give these jumps, both in time and space, but not to do it in a way that seemed cheap, to make the reader... I mean, one of the things that you earlier mentioned that Professor Chesterfield has various commandments that he utters. And one of the commandments he utters is "Thou shalt not confuse a story with a Rubik's Cube." And the idea behind that is that a story is not a joke, it's not a riddle, it's not about the reader trying to piece things together. I mean, readers do have to piece things together, but if it's simply an intellectual exercise in piecing things together, then then there's not enough payoff, there's no beef there. But what I think the writer needs to do is to make the reader piece things together, but also give the reader some signs along the way and make the reader pay attention to character. So I never wanted those leaps or jumps to be distractions. I wanted them to transport the reader. And so that was the balance I was always working on, making the reader feel like they'd moved somewhere new, but not confusing or disorienting the reader.
And in Matrimony, Julian takes a job as a writing instructor while Mia is working on her PhD. And it made me think of, from what I've read in your biographical information, your experiences teaching writing and what you've written about, especially while guest blogging, for example, at The Elegant Variation back in November, about the common issues that you run into reading students writing. And you say something that I found very interesting. You say that students want to avoid telling a story. And why do they want to avoid that?
Well, I think that there are a couple of reasons. I think some don't want to avoid it but have trouble doing it. And then some, because they have trouble doing it, turn a necessity into a virtue and try to avoid it. I think because, I'm teaching some very talented writers, and I think a lot of these writers tend to think that story is for hacks. They think it's for Michael Crichton and John Grisham, and they're better than that. But they may be better writers sentence by sentence, but I think that what those guys do is very important, and that telling a story is really essential, and that we live our lives in terms of stories, and that this is what makes our lives interesting. And I think that what I need to convince my students of is that telling a story, having there be tension, having there be plot in their stories, doesn't make them bad writers. And I think part of the issue for them, and for me, if really for every writer, is that writers spend a lot of time watching. We need to be observant people. And I think given how society is structured, we also want to avoid conflict. We sit, I live in New York, and I take the subway pretty regularly, and the time we spend on the subway is trying to avoid conflict. But what's very important for writers to know is that conflict is what makes fiction interesting. I tell my students that, you sit on the bus watching people, and nothing happens, and you're in total control. But if you sit on the bus and all of a sudden a stranger puts their hand on your thigh, you have to do something. You have to remove that hand. You have to shout. You have to, if you like that the stranger has put his or her hand on your thigh, you can encourage them to put the other hand on the thigh. You can do nothing, but in that case, doing nothing is doing something. What I'm always telling my students is that it's always the moments of conflict that explore character. I mean, it's easy to sit in the bus and watch and have nothing be at stake. You have a lot of pretty thoughts, a lot of deep observations, but things become inert because nothing is really happening. As soon as someone puts their hand on your thigh, then something has to happen. So I'm not saying that literally my students have to have their characters put their hands on each other's thighs, although if they want to, they're certainly welcome to. What I'm saying is that in a very deep metaphorical, figurative way, we need characters to put their hands on each other's thighs so that something will happen. And so I think what happens with a lot of my students is they're very good at telling stories if they sit around a bar, and they're very good raconteurs. But as soon as they get in front of the computer, they panic. And so what I really encourage them to do is not to panic, to take story seriously, because story informs character. I mean, I'm a character guy. I believe fiction is about character, but I think that you can't illuminate character without story. And I think there are other reasons for this problem that, students have trouble with story. A friend of mine in college wrote her undergraduate psychology thesis on how adults group objects versus how kids group objects. And adults group the apple with the banana, and kids group the monkey with the banana. And I think this is a way of illustrating that kids are more natural storytellers than adults are, that adults think in terms of category. And Flannery O'Connor, who is a wonderful fiction writer and also a wonderful essayist, talks about the ways that beginning writers try too much to write about big ideas. They think they're writing about love or war or alienation or anxiety. I'm always telling my students they're not writing about love, war, or alienation or anxiety. They're writing about Tom and Sally and what happens when Tom and Sally meet and something big happens. And I'm not saying that there aren't big ideas in fiction, but those ideas come in through the back door, and that a fiction writer is always using the particular to get at the general. But that if a fiction writer thinks in terms of the general, he or she gets into trouble, and they write abstraction. So I think that's another reason that a lot of writers have trouble with stories. They think they're supposed to be writing about big ideas. But big ideas are for philosophers and theologians and economists and political scientists. And those are professions that are important, but they're not what I do, and they're not what my student writers are doing. And then I think the final reason that maybe my student writers have trouble with story or are averse to story is that they're so afraid of going over the top. I mean, my students try to be subtle to the point of obfuscation. I mean, they think that they're being subtle, but as a colleague of mine once said, if you're going to be subtle, there better be something you're being subtle about. And I feel that sometimes my students are being so subtle that there isn't enough stuff there. And Charles Baxter, who's a wonderful writer and a former teacher and colleague of mine, has an essay in his book, Burning Down the House, called basically about melodrama. And he makes an argument in favor of melodrama. And I'm always telling my students, and I tell myself this too, that it's far better to go over the top because you can always cut back. You want to risk sentimentality in order to have sentiment. You don't want sentimentality. You don't want your story or your novel to be cheesy. But you also don't want the other problem, which is that the story has no heart. And so I think one of the reasons that my students avoid story is they are trying to avoid what they perceive to be cheesiness. But what I encourage them to do is to be cheesy, because you can always revise. I mean, this is why I spent 10 years and 3,000 pages, 10 years working on the book and erasing 3,000 pages, that I'm a control freak, and that I think that you can always cut back. So for all those reasons, I think both psychological and narrative, those are the kinds of reasons that my students avoid story. But I think story is very important for fiction. I'm a big believer in plot as a way of getting us at the depths of character.
That fear of sentimentality, is that a modern thing with writing students, or has it always, was it ever thus?
It's hard for me to know for sure, but I certainly think that my bet is that it's a fairly contemporary phenomenon. I mean, we live in the generation of irony where, we're impervious to everything, and where just, wearing your heart on your sleeve is considered sort of bad form and unsophisticated, while sort of in the olden days, there's much more sense of, earnestness. So I do think that we live in an anti-earnest time, and that may be one of the reasons that, certainly in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been sort of a real slew of ironic novels. Some of them are very good, but I'm a big believer in heart, and I think that I guess I'm old-fashioned in that sense. I'm certainly not advocating cheesiness or over-the-top writing. I think that's terrible. But I think writers are too afraid of going over the top. And I'd much rather risk being cheesy than risk being heartless. And so I do think it's maybe a phenomenon that's particularly true of my generation and of these times, more so than of older times, yeah.
You have written, especially when you guest blog once, a letter, it was called A Letter to a Young MFA, and now you're pro-MFA, you have the Master of Fine Art degree. Why is that? What do you think the MFA offers a writer?
I'm pro-MFA in a very specific context. I'm not arguing that MFA programs are perfect or that they're right for everyone. Actually, and some people have asked me, here I am having written on blogs, and I also wrote an essay in the recent issue of Poets and Writers called In Defense of MFA Programs. And yet when Julian, my main character, goes to an MFA program, he has a fairly negative experience there, and my novel doesn't portray MFA programs that positively, and people have sort of seen what seems like a potential contradiction between the novel and what my own feelings are. And, what I've said is that I think for a character like Julian, who's been in so many writing workshops before and who's working on a novel, and novels are not always the easiest thing to do in writing workshops as opposed to short stories, and also because he hasn't really come to the Iowa Writers Workshop from a position of strength, and rather he's moved there to get away from Mia. For all those reasons, there are certainly people for whom MFA programs are not the right thing, and I've certainly seen bad matches. Difficult and not very attentive professors and students who are either, on one hand, too defensive so they can't listen to any criticism, or pleasers to too great an extent where they're really sort of trying to appeal to everyone. And I think the ideal student in an MFA workshop is someone who can hear criticism seriously, but also knows how to make the story his or her own. That's sort of a preface to why I would say that MFA programs are not perfect. On the other hand, I think they're way too criticized. And I think that comes from a couple of reasons. I think a lot of people believe that writing can't be taught, and I think that's just silly. I mean, it's true that, you can't teach anyone to be Faulkner, but no one says that, you can't teach everyone to be Thelonious Monk, and therefore you shouldn't have piano lessons. I mean, people really accept piano lessons, dance lessons, athletes, professional tennis players start training with, highly paid coaches when they're 3 or 4 years old. Ballerinas do that. So what is it about writing that makes people look askance at writing classes in a way they don't look askance at other kinds of classes? And I think the reason for that is that there's a kind of weird belief that writing is something that we should be able to all do naturally, since we all do it in some ways in our lives. We write letters, we write emails, we write grocery lists. So it's close enough to what we do day to day. The idea of teaching it seems somewhat foreign. No one thinks that ballet is something we do day to day, so it's totally understood why you would need a lesson to learn violin or to learn ice skating or to learn ballet. People think that writing is really what we do every moment. And although it's true that we do write every moment, the kinds of writing we do in letters and emails and grocery lists and such things is really quite different from the kind of writing you do in fiction writing workshops. And so I think it's quite startling to people until they actually take a course to realize that teaching can be quite helpful. And the other thing, every writing class is different, but what my writing classes are like is that I'm really teaching people to be more self-conscious readers, to react instinctively, to say, I like this or I don't like that, and to imitate what they like and to avoid what they don't like. And so for me, a writing class is really a reading class, and I think you teach people to get out of the way of their own mistakes. And although I know that there have been people who've had bad experiences in MFA programs, for me as a student, the time to write and the kind of attention I got was extremely instrumental. It helped me get to be the writer that I am now, and I certainly have seen students of mine improve tremendously over the course of time. So I think when people criticize MFA programs, they tend to do it with a standard that's unreasonable. You're not going to make someone into Hemingway or Faulkner. Well, you may not make everyone into Hemingway or Faulkner, but how many Hemingways or Faulkners or Virginia Woolfs are there out there? And I've certainly never seen an MFA program take someone who's really talented and make them merely mediocre. People like to say that MFA programs create merely competent writers. But I kind of say so be it. I mean, law schools create merely competent lawyers, and no one has a problem with that. And I certainly think that a competent or even mediocre lawyer is a far more dangerous thing than a competent or merely mediocre writer. And I've certainly seen some very talented writers come out of MFA programs. So my defense of MFA programs is really in response to the real wave of criticism that's out there that says MFA programs are bad things and that teaching writing is pointless. I would say that there are MFA programs that don't work for some people and that there are people who have had some bad experiences in them. But I certainly think that on balance, in the right hands, they can be terrific. They were terrific for me, and I'd like to think that they've been terrific for at least some of my students.
In Matrimony, when Julian goes to the Iowa Writers Program, he's, as you said, fleeing Mia, but he also finds he doesn't mesh well with the program. Is that solely because of his personal problems and that he's there because of his personal problems? Or is there something about Julian the writer that is not at home in workshops and can't be? Yeah,
I think it's complicated. I mean, part has to do with his personal problems. I don't think he's someone who's not at home in workshops per se. I think on some level he sort of got his MFA in college. I mean, throughout college he was taking writing workshops. And you see this phenomenon much more now. And for me it was a different thing because I didn't start writing until after college. So when I came to graduate school, writing workshops were new. But now, I teach at Sarah Lawrence where these kids are allowed as undergraduates to take as many workshops as they want. And you'll see now some students who come to graduate school who have been in 9, 10, 11 workshops. I just think that's too much, and that there's a way in which they're workshopped out. I think Julian might be a case of that. It's really too much more of the same thing, his coming to workshop at Iowa. And then I think there's a lot of luck, and a lot depends on the fashions of the times. When I was in an MFA program, I was at the University of Michigan in the early 90s. The writers that people were reading at the time were people like Raymond Carver and Ann Beattie and Tobias Wolff and Amy Hempel, Jane Ann Phillips. These were sort of what people like to call, for the most part, the dirty realists. And they were writing a sort of more realist, minimalist prose. Now you see much more in writing programs. The people who people are reading are David Foster Wallace, George Saunders, Amy Bender, who I know is a Southern California writer. All of them are very good writers of different kinds of writers from the kinds of writers who were in vogue at the time. And I think Julian finds that he's sort of out of fashion. He's a quieter, more character-driven writer among a bunch of people at Iowa, at least in his class, who are less interested in character than he is, who are sort of more maximalist, more focused on language for language's sake, or more kinds of ironic writers. And this, every year it's different. There's a lot of luck. So it's possible that if Julian had gone to Iowa the year afterwards or the year before, he would have been with students who were more in sync with him. So I think he happens to have come at a time where his work and his aesthetic doesn't find the kind of reception that he would have liked. And so he's a little out of whack there. I think there is a multiplicity of reasons, why Iowa doesn't prove to be as helpful to him as it might have been. But I certainly wouldn't say that Julian temperamentally is someone who isn't suited to workshops. He just may not be suited to this workshop at this time, given who he is now and what he's done in the past.
There was something more I wanted to touch on about our old friend, Professor Chesterfield. Now, he makes another appearance toward the end of Matrimony, and he has been working on a novel of his own for a very long time, sort of a legendary waiting period between his last work and the novel that it proves to be his final novel. And Chesterfield's novel, it turns out, is not a great novel. It's a mediocre novel. And it got me comparing that with Julian, who was working on what in the book is implied or said to be a good novel. And if it's Matrimony, as you say, if it's like Matrimony or is Matrimony, then it is good. What did Chesterfield do wrong that you and Julian did right?
It's hard to know. Chesterfield's working on his book for 40 years. And there certainly are books that you can work on for 40 years that work. But at a certain point, if you're working on a book as long as that, there probably are ways in which the book is in some way not coming together. I know writers who are very good writers who really should put their books away and move on to something new, because not every book is going to work. I've been fortunate so far, and I haven't had to throw an entire book away, although I've thrown the equivalent of many books away in these 3,000 pages that I threw out. But I do think there comes a point where the book just isn't working and that it becomes counterproductive to keep going with it. So I think, it could be argued that Chesterfield may just not be that good a writer, that he had that one hit early on, and that he's a case of those who do and those who can't teach. But I actually don't think that's the case. I think that for whatever reason he wasn't able to give up on a novel, and that's a hard thing to do. You've put in a lot of time, and I think it's very important for a writer to be stubborn. I know that I'm very stubborn myself. But there certainly was a point that maybe two-thirds of the way through the writing of this book where the book wasn't coming together, and at some point I thought, well, maybe this book isn't going to happen. And I didn't really give up on it, but I put it down. I wrote a couple of stories. I wrote 100 pages of a new novel that is now the next novel that I'm working on. So I wouldn't say I gave up, but it was important for me to put Matrimony away for a while in order to come back to it and figure it out. But it wasn't guaranteed that the book was going to work. I feel fortunate that it did work, but I may come upon a project at some point that doesn't work, and I think it's important for a writer to know when to give up. And I think that Professor Chesterfield may have been too stubborn for his own good, that at a certain point, at the pace that he was going at, it was possible that book wasn't the right book. And there are a lot of great writers out there who will tell you they have books away in a drawer that didn't work, and then all of a sudden, the next book they wrote really came together. I kind of feel that the bad days are investments in the good days, and the pages that you throw out are pages that, will lead you to better pages in other books. So it's possible that Professor Chesterfield just made a mistake and that he should have given up on this book, and if he had started another book, that book might have really worked, but for some reason he was too obstinate. He wasn't able to do that. That's a hard thing for a writer to figure out, is when the time to give up is and when the time to push on is.
The novel, once again, is Matrimony. Joshua Henkin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
For more on Joshua Henkin and Matrimony, visit his website, joshuahenkin, HENKIN.com. Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. He also goes under the names Ice Ben and DJ Concept. Check out his website, www.benalthouse, that's BENALTHOUSE.com. Find our complete show archive, our Frapper map, and more on our website, www.colinmarshallradio.com/market